Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the privilege of giving the opening talk. This is an exciting week. As I'm sure most of you know, it will continue through most of the week, through Thursday or Friday, with events organized around the topic of compassion. Now, my own perspective reflects 50 years of studying emotion, primarily from a Darwinian perspective. And then, through a strange set of accidents, not intention, the opportunity to get to know and to have, I guess now about 60 hours of one-on-one conversations with the Dalai Lama about emotion and compassion. And in fact, in my most recent book, Moving Towards Global Compassion, it's really dedicated to him because I would not have concerned myself with the issue of compassion if it wasn't for his influence. I've also had the benefit of many discussions with Alan Wallace, a wonderful meditation teacher and theorist, and with Matthew Ricard. But don't blame any of them for what I'm about to tell you. Let's first look at the object of our compassion, the person who physical pain or psychological pain we're trying to relieve or at least acknowledge. But for some, it isn't, the emphasis isn't on pain, physical or mental, but on a malaise, trying to deal with a malaise, a more general feeling of discontent with how their life is being led. And then, from a more Buddhist perspective, I hope you can all see this. Can you all see this? It's behind me, so I'm looking at this in front. It's the failure to grasp the nature of interdependence, a lack of wisdom. This is much more to the tiny bit of understanding I have of Buddhist thinking, this is much more what they have in mind in terms of the suffering. Now, this is all on the person we're trying to help, but let's turn to the helper. How did that happen? Now, does the person who sees the physical pain or mental pain, the person who senses the malaise, what's their focus? Is it empathetic feelings? Is it an action? Those people who are going over to Liberia are not just, as I watched last night on PBS, part of the news hour, and you saw what was going on in Liberia, and it's absolutely extraordinary, ghastly level of horrific suffering. But some people are going over there. They're not just feeling as terrible as I felt, they're acting to try to relieve the suffering. Now, more generally, people speak about a concern about the suffering of others. As a psychologist, I'm not sure what to do with that term. And then there is, from the Buddhist view, an aspiration. So I started with the sufferer. I've moved now to the other, to you, the person experiencing compassion for the other. Now, is compassion an emotion? The only real candidate for that, back up. How did I do that? I missed a set of questions. Okay. Do you have to have the empathetic feelings? Do they have to register at least in consciousness, do you have to suffer yourself before acting? Is that what leads to action? Or can action occur without that? We don't know the answer to that. We could find out the answer to that, and you're shortly going to find that what I'm going to do is really keep telling you about questions we don't know the answer to, but that are answerable. It wouldn't take rocket science to learn a lot more about it. How does concern differ from empathetic feelings? Is it an emotion? Is it a motivation? Is it an aspiration? And what happens when we repeatedly see people suffering in contexts that we can't do anything about? Does that magnify our compassion? Or does it tend to diminish it? Again, we don't know the answer to that. All right, now my next slide. If there is any kind of compassionate relationship that might be considered an emotion, it's that between caretaker, usually mother, and infant, because it's universal. It only makes the newspapers when someone doesn't do it. It's what we expect. We don't say, why are you spending so much time taking care of your baby? Of course you are. That's what you have to do. That's what's built into us. And it's to alleviate the physical or mental suffering of your offspring. And you all know this as parents. That's what you do. That's your job. It isn't a job you can resign from. You may not have realized when you took it on, it's a lifelong job. Doesn't end when they grow up. You still feel it. So I call this proximal compassion, because you're trying to prevent immediate physical suffering or pain. But when I was a parent, I still am a parent, when I had children at home, I spent most of my time trying to prevent suffering. Wear a helmet. Don't use hard drugs. Don't drink to excess. This is all preventive, to prevent suffering. This is what I call distal compassion. It's trying to prevent suffering in the future. It's much more cognitively based, and it's much more educable. It requires good social forecasting to know what are the harms that you might be able to advise and organize things so they wouldn't occur. So here are characteristics of emotion that are found in familial compassion. All of these characteristics, which I've described at some length in writings about emotion, that the decision, the appraisal is automatic, it's fast. We see it in other animals. You'll hear from some of our speakers on the panel who've been studying compassion in other animals. Emotions are not unique to humans, neither is compassion. It can be quick. It's unbidden. It happens to us. We don't choose it. And it's inescapable. That refractory period is a term I use to try to talk about the extent to which, when we're feeling an emotion, all the information available to us is filtered to fit and sustain the emotion we're feeling. That can be very functional if it's short term. But here are two characteristics that we find in many of the emotions. It's not certain whether they've been firmly established. Some of my friends and colleagues think they have. I'm not yet convinced there's a universal signal for compassion, face or voice. Or the work on the physiology, is it unique to compassion? But whether we want to argue about the evidence for that or not, here's two characteristics that are found in all emotions that are not found in familial compassion. I can be angry at anyone. I can be angry at the weather. I can be angry it's so foggy today. I can be angry I didn't get enough sleep last night. Actually, I did. But the target's totally unconstrained. Familial compassion names the target. It's a member of the family. It's a constrained target. Makes it totally different from emotions. Just like fear. I can be afraid of anything. Target's unconstrained. And the other thing is that all emotions can be enacted in either a constructive or destructive fashion. But compassion is always constructive. It may not succeed, but it's never destructive to the other. So let's stay with familial compassion for a moment more and consider what determines the strength. Is it shared genes? Do you feel more familial compassion towards your brother than your cousin? We don't know the answer to that. We could find out the answer to that. Is it shared contact? Maybe it doesn't matter how many genes you share, but how much you've seen that person in the past. Or maybe the age. Do you feel as much compassion for your 50-year-old offspring as you do for your 5-week-old offspring? Is age the determinant? Or is the caregiver's upbringing and personality? And lastly, the social forecasting, if we're talking about distal. Now, we don't know. We have all the tools. We don't have to invent them. To get answers to this, we don't know the answers. These are all researchable questions. Now let's consider stranger compassion. Compassion that is felt towards people you don't know, like those people in Liberia. Now, there are strangers within our own country. There are strangers who have the same race and speak the same language and have the same religion, but they're strangers, you don't know them. What's the extent? So, this is really a gradient. The Buddhist ideal, which was also Charles Darwin's ideal, and as best I can tell, he came to it himself. He didn't come to it from having studied Buddhist writings, was that what I'm calling global compassion for all human beings is an ideal. Now, we can also distinguish compassion in terms of its centrality in the life of the individual. I mean, I might occasionally, usually particularly at the end of the year, I get requests for donations to a whole variety of causes. And so I make my occasional donation. Or I can do what the radio station wants me to do, is give them $12 every month and commit myself to doing it. That's periodic. Or it can actually determine the whole organization of your life. It's what you're doing with your life. It's where you're living, how you're spending your time. There are people like that. Not many, but some. Human beings are capable of that kind of central global compassion. So here's the big question for me. I hope it will be the big question for you. Is global stranger compassion a gift, which just some people have, like musical ability? We don't say, why isn't everybody a Mozart? In fact, we think it's foolish if you think you're going to be able, through practice, to become a Mozart. It's a rare gift. Athletic skill. Most of us, I doubt there's anyone sitting in this room who's going to become an Olympic athlete. You might get good at it, but you need the gift in order, with practice, to go further. That's one theory. That's the theory of some very highly regarded Buddhist theorists. It's a gift. You can cultivate it, but you don't have the seed. The other possibility is that it's inherent in all people, and it requires certain experiences to be activated. Now, the toddler research, which you're going to hear about from members of the panel and been studied by others, suggests strongly that concern for the suffering of others is right there early in life. For strangers, what happens to it? Well, there is some research that suggests that it changes 4 to 6 years of age, becomes more limited just to in-group, not to everyone. We don't really know why that's the case. Now, compassionate joy, I'm not the first to suggest that when you act compassionately, it feels good. There's a unique feeling of enjoyment. The Dalai Lama says it's like a piece of chocolate. You don't have to be taught. The act itself is rewarding. When I was watching on television some of these nurses and doctors talking about why they went to Liberia, it felt good that there are people like this. Now, maybe the people who show the most global compassion just happen to have much stronger compassionate joy. Again, we don't know the answer. Again, we have the tools to find out. So I'm laying out for you a taxonomy of compassion. I'm an old-fashioned taxonomist. First, I described for you the type of suffering that was responded to: physical or mental pain, malaise, or life dissatisfaction. Next, I described the response to that: shared feelings, actions, or concern. Next, I described immediacy. Are you responding to something that's distal, off in the future, or proximal? Right there, right in front of your nose. And lastly, the target. Is it in the family? Familiars are people you know, but they're not family members. Your best friend, your next door neighbor. Strangers, and then all sentient beings, which is what the Buddhists are after. And interestingly enough, in 1873, Darwin used that phrase to say that it's the highest moral virtue is to be concerned about the suffering of all sentient beings. The Dalai Lama was shocked that, and now he considers himself a Darwinian. So let's put this taxonomy together. We have 3 types of suffering with 2 types of responses. We're up to 6. With immediacy, proximal or distal, so now we're up to 12. With 5 targets, 60 different. Or are they different? Or in what respects are they different? We can distinguish them. Do the distinctions matter? I'll argue that they do. First, we need to know whether we're talking about the same type of compassion. Which one of the 60 are you talking about, or you? But the more important reason is that it'll expose questions that can be answered with research. I'm going to give you just 5 examples. They're all drawn from my recent less than 100-page book, Moving Towards Global Compassion. And I'm only going to deal with stranger compassion. All Are there some genetic factors that predispose individuals to have stranger compassion? If we looked at the data set that Bouchard and his colleagues gathered years ago of identical twins reared apart, if one of them was a heavy indulger in compassion, would the other one be, if they're identicals? We could get the answer to that. It's sitting in a drawer somewhere. What would we do with it? It's a different matter. But at least we would know that there's something in your genetic background. And then, of course, it raises all the questions about epigenesis. How compassionately you act, will that affect how compassionate your offspring will be? There is some suggestive research with mice that that might be possible. Do cultures differ? Are there some cultures where everybody has stranger compassion? Alan Wallace said that was so of Tibet before the Chinese came in. We don't have any documentation. Could it be? And would it be a result of culture, or would those cultures be highly inbred, not doing much marrying out? Now, we see all kinds of suffering and pain. Does that enhance, detract, or is it irrelevant? Do people who engage in global compassion, if we looked at their life histories, if we built up an index of such people and went through their life history, would we find that they spent most of their childhood watching Mr. Rogers rather than violent films? We could get an answer to that. We don't know. Now, I mentioned earlier that some early research now is suggesting that somewhere 4 to 6, toddlers no longer try to console everyone, only in group. Would that be so if they were earlier exposed to many different kinds of people? Is it only because they're exposed to people of one demographic characteristic? Are there extreme experiences that turn on or turn off stranger compassion? Life-changing experiences. I believe the answer to this is yes, no data. Now, I've outlined in this little book 23. You've just seen 5 of the 23 questions about stranger compassion. There are 33 about resonance and empathy, and you can read the numbers. There's a total of 152 questions I've squeezed into this little book. They're all researchable questions. We could get the answers to all of them and know more about how we can move the world towards global compassion. Thank you very much. There's time for questions.
Learn more about compassion in terms of its impact on the earth. And I'm wondering if in your research you may have thought about, well, can we transfer some of this to compassion for the earth? I know that includes people, but the focus is primarily on the earth.
I tend to think that in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, we could get away with being selfish, concerned just about ourselves and perhaps our immediate family, and the hell with everyone else. The 21st century, it's clear that we're all connected. The Buddhists were right. Climate change, the shortages of water, of energy, of food, These are worldwide, and they will impact worldwide. We're degrading the earth that we depend on for all of the resources that are life necessary. So this emphasis on global compassion is actually, it's an urgent necessity, I believe. And those of us in the behavioral sciences, we can get answers to some of these questions that could help us move more quickly in that direction. Another question.
I would like to submit Bali as a compassionate nation. I spent a month there recently, and of the hundreds of people I interacted with, each of them was as compassionate as I could imagine. I think one of the interesting reasons is that when something goes wrong, you don't blame anything, you don't become depressed. The reason something goes wrong in your life, whatever it is that your ancestors forgot to do something, make an offering to the gods. And all you have to do is correct it now. So there's no, there's virtually no depression, and there's no vengeance, no anger. And with that, people are just very outgoing, caring, from every level, from the busboy to the service people to the people, maybe except for people driving motor scooters. But without that exception, I was just very impressed, and I wonder if there's been any research on looking at Bali as a compassionate nation.
That was Phil Zimbardo, if my eyes are working, who asked that question. And it's I've been in Bali a few times. It's the relationship between sort of the ideology you're brought up with and the expectations that sets. The research question that I would like to see answered, which I hadn't thought of, it's not in this book, next edition, Phil, is what happens to Balinese who move to America, who move to Los Angeles, who get jobs in any of the competitive industries? Can they do it? Or does it get wiped out? Do they stay? What happens? What's the difference between the Balinese who marry out versus those who marry other Balinese? So there are a lot of interesting questions that are raised by that. Another question. Right down here in front.
Thanks. I was wondering if you thought that affective empathy, sort of this empathetic feeling, was necessary to motivate compassion, because I feel like there's a split in the field about whether perspective taking can just sort of occur on a more cognitive level and be a guide to moral concern, or whether sort of the more emotional underpinnings are necessary to motivate that.
It's a good question. We don't know the answer to it. Darwin wrote that the reason I help someone who is suffering is because when I see their suffering, I feel it. It makes me suffer. So it's a selfish act. I act to reduce your suffering, to reduce my empathetic suffering. Now, the Dalai Lama, when I told him about this, that's kindergarten. That happens at the beginning. But someone who has worked to actively cultivate, and the Buddhists have practices to cultivate compassion. We know that those practices produce changes in the brain. We don't know enough about whether they produce sustained changes in how they act towards others, particularly others who suffer. So, good question. You can add it to the list that need to be researched. I think I have time for one more fast question.
She said for me to go ahead. With some of our most chronically ill mental health people ending up in the American correctional institutions, has this study or the message been brought into such places yet?
You know, that's where I started my career. I was trained originally as a clinical psychologist, did my last year of training at Langley Porter working with depressed patients. And I have not myself done what you're suggesting, but I think it would be very interesting to try that as its own therapeutic technique. And I know that from one of our panelists, we're going to hear something about a form of therapy that is compassion-focused. I don't recall whether it's been applied to people with the most severe, but to people with bipolar in particular, be very interesting to try compassion training, both distal and proximal. It says I have 51, nope, I'm over time. Thank you very much.